I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. Lise Roemelle is an education program coordinator for the Healing Community Study. She is a licensed registered nurse and earned her MSN degree from State University of New York at Stony Brook. Lisa is a certified nurse educator who has taught pre-licensed nursing students with a focus in maternity nursing and fundamentals of nursing. For over 6 years, Lisa has volunteered with Smart Recovery, serving as a facilitator for the Family and Friends online meetings. So welcome, Lise Roemelle.
All right. So thank you, John. A little background about myself. Like John mentioned, I facilitate the Smart Recovery Family and Friends meetings, and I've been doing that for about 7 or 8 years now. And what attracted me to Smart was all the tools, the Smart tools that they offer, especially the CSOs, concerned significant others of someone with an addiction. And these tools are basically cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. They're very easy to learn, and they can be implemented in all situations. So instead of families hearing the message, oh, you just have to wait until they are ready to accept treatment, or you have to wait until they hit rock bottom, or you're just powerless over the situation, these tools enable the CSO, the family and friend member, to be empowered to make decisions and also change the dynamics of the relationship with the loved one that could possibly influence that person to enter treatment. We know that families are on the front lines of the substance use crisis. They witness a lot of risky behavior. They're witnessing overdoses, deaths, and it's a very scary time for the CSO and the families and friends. So when you can offer tools that can help them possibly empower them and change that relationship, they can be very impactful and very helpful. So as I got more involved in Smart Recovery, I first started off as a meeting helper, and then I started to facilitate the meetings weekly, and I really look forward to my weekly meetings. I learned so much from the participants that come to my meeting, and it's a really rewarding experience. So for today, I hope the session is very interactive. Please feel free to unmute your mic and share some comments or ask questions, or put some comments in the chat box. I will be monitoring that as well as John. So if I don't see it, he'll mention it to me, or use the raise hand feature and we can call on you. I really want it to be a learning session for everybody involved. There we go, right? So I have to go over some housekeeping items first. I don't have any financial disclosures to announce. And the practice gaps that we have identified here is that Smart Recovery tools use evidence-based methods that often help family and friends of a person with an addiction disorder, but is often not recommended by healthcare providers, government, community, and general public when advising individuals on mutual self-help groups. And the educational needs that will be addressed as Smart Recovery tools can empower concerned significant others to develop effective coping strategies that can increase the likelihood that their loved one will seek long-term recovery. So the objectives, learning objectives for today, I'm going to go over the 4-point system that Smart Recovery has developed, and then I'm going to describe the specific tools to help individuals reach those goals related to that 4-point system, and then also discuss ways that you can engage your significant others in utilizing those SMART tools. So then hopefully at the end of today's session that you will be able to apply these tools to help the concerned significant others reach their recovery goals. So the acronyms that I will use for this session, LO will stand for loved one, and that is the individual with the alcohol or substance use disorder. CSO is a concerned significant other, and this could be family, partner, spouse, friend of a loved one. And then I will talk about what's called the CRAFT resources, the CRAFT strategies, and that stands for community reinforcement and family training, but basically they're strategies specifically geared for the family and friend member. And then in case you don't know what SMART stands for, it's self-management and recovery training. So what I want to start off first with is just to find out, who is in this session here today. Let me know if you drop in the chat box if you do facilitate a smart recovery meeting or a family and friends smart recovery meeting, or you work with families of individuals with an addiction disorder. Just want to see how familiar people are in this session with the smart recovery principles, and how many of you do work with the families. And as you drop that message in the chat box, let me go over some of the recovery principles, so that those people that are not familiar with smart recovery will get a little familiar. So the main principle for smart recovery is that their main focus is self-empowerment. They encourage participants to take responsibility for their own recovery. The tools that they offer can help the participants gain independence from addictive behavior. And then it also helps the CSOs change their responses around the loved one. So they believe that there's not just one path to recovery. There are many options, and that person should pick and choose what option works best and meets their needs. They are a mutual self-help group. So as participants recover and progress in the recovery, they encourage to help new participants who come on in the meetings. It's mainly volunteer-based. It's almost all run by volunteers, a few administrative staff. They believe in evidence-based practices, so they use strategies that have been proven to be effective through research, such as cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, craft strategies, and medication like MOUD. And then also they believe in the principle of collaboration. So they encourage participants to augment their smart recovery experience with professional therapy, medication, or other mutual self-help groups. So how is smart recovery different than the other mutual support groups? Well, SMART believes in the power to change addictive behavior resides within each individual, and it doesn't depend on an adherence to any particular spiritual viewpoint. So the use of religious or spiritual beliefs and practices in recovery is just a personal choice. They also believe that individuals have the power of choice, and they're not powerless over their life and the decisions that they make. They support the use of medication to treat addictions and psychiatric disorders. They strongly discourage the use of labels such as disease, alcoholic, addict, enabler, codependent. They feel that those labels are very damaging. And they encourage people to attend meetings until the strategies are learned, not necessarily a lifetime. So at SMART, they really believe that each individual finds their own path to change. For some, that path may also include attending one of the 12-step programs like AA and NA. And while the SMART approach is different than the 12-step approach, it doesn't exclude them. And we have many participants that attend our SMART meetings as well as the 12-step meeting. So just to give you a little layout of a typical meeting, we first do a welcome and introduction, and the facilitator just introduces themselves, and then we provide a few basic guidelines and housekeeping just so that everyone is aware of the general rules. And then we spend some time with the check-in. And with the check-in, what people do is report what's happening to them recently or how they're coping with their situation, any successes they've had, any challenges, but they can also pass too. Nobody is mandated to provide a check-in. And then based on that check-in, we set the agenda. So the agenda is set based on what the participants who did the check-in, what was the overriding theme. Maybe a few of them mentioned a particular topic that they want to talk about. Maybe somebody brought up a situation that appears to be here, urgent and wants to be, discussed at that meeting. So we'll put that on the agenda, and we try to keep it to about 3, maybe 4 items, so it doesn't get to be too overwhelming. And then that becomes our basic meeting, the whole working time. So we work on a SMART tool. And the neat thing about the meetings is that everybody participates. Everybody's adding and, providing suggestions of what worked for them. So that can help that individual who had that particular issue when they announced that in the check-in. And then after that, we do a pass the hat. And like any other mutual self-help group, of course, we are dropping in a link in the online meetings to the donation page. And then what's kind of neat with Smart Recovery, at the end of the meeting, we go around the room again and ask the members to talk about what was a aha moment, or what was your one takeaway from this meeting? What was the thing that was significant that maybe you can work on through the week to help you? So, it's really nice to hear those ending comments from everybody. And most Smart Recovery meetings are 90 minutes in length. So let me just look at the chat box here and see how often many of you do facilitate SMART. Oh, this is wonderful to hear. Oh, a lot of, several of you there have said that. So I'm glad to hear that. And please feel free, for those people that are comfortable with the SMART meeting and you do a facilitator, let me know what works for you. Like I said, I hope this is a great learning session for everybody involved. So SMART program has developed what they call a 4-point system, and that is the heart of the program. So each point provides tools and techniques and strategies to help those on the recovery side, as well as the CSOs reach their goals. And the 4-point system is the same for loved ones or the CSO. It's just been adapted to meet the needs of the CSO. And what I'm going to do in today's session is cover these 4 points and talk about which tools are appropriate to meet these goals. But my focus today will be on CSOs. But do keep in mind that these tools are good for loved ones and CSOs alike. So point 1, it focuses on building and maintaining motivation and change. And we know that can be very challenging. We know that change is a process. It's not an event, and it usually doesn't happen overnight. And it takes a lot of effort to achieve. So in my meetings, what I like to do is review those 5 stages of change so that CSO can really understand, what does it take to make somebody change? How difficult it is to make change in behavior. And hopefully that they can gain an insight into where their loved one is in relation to making a change. So briefly, what I will talk about is pre-contemplation. That's a stage when somebody's just not aware of the need to make a change. It isn't really denial. It's the person sees themselves as fine and they're in control of their life. So what I tell CSOs is, if they're going to nag or urge their loved one to try to make a change, that can be a waste of time and energy, and it usually ends up in a fight and an argument. So when a person reaches contemplation, that's a time when this person starts to reflect on some situations and behaviors that have been troubling or disturbing to them. Maybe they received a DUI, or maybe they experienced an embarrassment at an event, or maybe the CSO is starting to realize all that nagging is making the situation worse. So they start to explore possible changes, but they still feel very ambivalent about making change. They're not sure if it's going to provide any benefits. So there's a tool out there called the cost benefit analysis. And that tool is very helpful for individuals that are in this contemplation stage of change. And I'm going to go over that in a couple minutes here. When a person has reached preparation stage, more disturbing events have taken place, and that person has concluded on their own that they need to make a change. And that's what's important. They have made that decision. Nobody else has told them that they have to change. They have made it on their own. So they start to think about ways they can make these changes. They're open about hearing some options that are out there. And there is a tool called the Change Plan Worksheet, and that is really helpful for individuals in this preparation stage, because filling out that change plan worksheet will help serve as a guidebook, a playbook for them to implement these changes. And we're going to go over that too here in a couple minutes. So once the person decides the changes that they can do and they feel like they can do them, they hit the action stage. And action is just putting that behavioral change into effect and evaluating, is this working, is this not? And they're starting to build confidence in this new behavior. And then once they do that over a period of time, then they've reached that maintenance stage. And maintenance is basically implementing that new behavior without any effort. They have no desire to go back to their old ways of doing things. They see the benefits of making this change and they're happy, with this change. So when you talk about the change process, it's very important, especially to CSOs, that you remind them returning to old behaviors is part of the change process and is seen as quite normal. CSOs need to be reminded that if this happens, individuals should never be shamed for returning back to old ways. Just say it's part of the learning process, encouraging them and supporting them as they get back on track. And I think it's also important to note and inform CSOs that change doesn't happen because you're forcing someone to make a change. Change happens when it makes sense to that person. They need to see benefits of that change. So that's why change will never happen when someone else is telling them that you've got to change. So when working with your CSOs, encourage them to use those motivational interviewing type questions, questions that could help the loved one reflect and possibly see a need for change, such as, what do you like the most about your substance use? Or what are the benefits you get from your substance use? Or what are some worries you have about using? Or how do you feel about changing your behavior? Those questions are non-threatening, and it also allows that loved one to reflect on the possibility of making changes and looking at their situation. So it can be very helpful in that change process. So I think too, it's important to point out to CSOs that their loved one doesn't use substances because they're bad or immoral. They use because they get something from it that they like, they want, they need. Maybe it's a human connection or pleasure. Maybe when they're using with a group of people or drinking with a group of people, they feel connected and bonded and they feel like they're not being judged. Or maybe it's taken away something uncomfortable like anxiety or depression or boredom. And it makes sense for them to continue this behavior, even though there are downsides to using. So judging their behavior or actions instead of trying to understand them will only make that person very defensive. They'll shut them down and force them to lie when they are questioned or challenged. So statements like, oh, you're just being lazy, or you're not trying hard enough. While these statements are often commonly said from the CSO, they come from a high level of frustration, they're not helpful. They're very basically judgmental statements, and they can do a lot of harm. So trying to help that CSO to understand that when their loved one feels understood, especially by people that are close to them, they're the most influential people around them. That can set the stage for them to become more engaged and ultimately motivated to change their own behavior. So when the CSO can hit that pause button, reflect, and not react, this will allow them time to really problem solve, search for alternative ways to help their loved one. Hopefully over that time, they'll develop the empathy. And instead of thinking, oh, they're just being irresponsible, it'll help that CSO to motivate them to connect to their loved one in a meaningful way. And when they can collaborate and problem solve together as a team, instead of that confrontation and that headbutting all the time, that can be a game changer. And it can change the way the loved one sees their situation and motivate them to make some positive moves. So a helpful tool to understanding the loved one's behavior is to have that CSO do what we call a behavior analysis of the loved one's use. So when they can understand who, when, where they use, they can understand the triggers, the benefits they get from using, the negative sides. This can help the CSO understand their use and the alternatives that maybe the loved one would be open to trying, maybe therapy or counseling or new hobbies or activities of some sort. So when a CSO can complete this exercise, it's just put it in a table form, write it out so they can visually see those answers. And when they complete that, this can help guide the CSO to maybe looking at, number one, they're trying to understand their behavior and their using, as well as direct them to possibly alternative strategies. And this tool can be very effective when CSOs are trying to wrap their head around, like, why does he or she continue to do these things when it's hurting them? You know, so this is a helpful tool when they're at that stage. So a tool to help motivate individuals in making that behavioral change is what we call the CBA tools, cost benefit analysis. And this is a great exercise for those individuals that were in that contemplation stage of change. They were ambivalent about changing. Maybe the loved one's ambivalent about changing their substance use, or the CSO's ambivalent about changing the way they respond to the loved one's situation. But basically, this tool helps individuals weigh costs and benefits, or the pros and cons, of continuing a particular behavior, and the costs and benefits, or the pros and cons, of stopping a particular behavior. So how this tool works is you have that person get out a sheet of paper. Of course, you could do this on a Word document, that would be fine, but you divide the paper in 4 squares. And on the top of the paper, you would label that top, the heading, you know, the costs and benefits, or the pros and cons of continuing that particular behavior. For the loved one, maybe using. For the CSO, maybe they want to change their nagging or pleading. And then they would go to look at all the benefits to continuing that particular behavior, and they would list those under the benefits or the pros. And then they would start to look at what are the negatives, what are the downsides of the cost of continuing with this particular behavior. And then once they complete that, then they would start to look at what would happen if I stopped using, or what would happen if I stopped nagging and pleading. You know, what could I perceive as being the benefit to that? And then they would list those things. And then they would also reflect on what would be the negatives, or what would be my concerns if I stopped using or stopped nagging and pleading, you know, and putting that list down together. So this is not a quick exercise. You let the CSO and the loved ones, this works for both situations, that this may take up to a week for them to complete it, because as they reflect on certain things, they can add to the list. But hopefully once this is done, that the person can see that the benefits of stopping far outweigh the benefits of continuing with that current behavior. And the costs of continuing have more negative impact than the cost of stopping. And it's, again, important to have that visual view. So you want to encourage them to write this down or put it on a Word document, because just thinking about it in their head, it is not as impactful as seeing it visually. So a key to helping individuals make that successful behavioral changes is helping them through that planning process. So this worksheet from Smart Recovery, and I think John's going to put that link in the chat box for me. this helps an individual develop plans for making a change in behavior. And this tool is very effective for those individuals that are in that planning stage. So remember, they know they want to make a change and they have thought about the changes they need to make. Now they need a guidebook, that serves as their playbook to carry out these changes. So this can increase the likelihood that they will carry this out, make it successful. So I know on the slide, it may be a little bit difficult to read. So that's why I had John share the link. You can pull it up on your own screen. But the first statement they would reflect on is what's the changes they want to make? And they would list specific areas of the ways they want to change. Maybe it's, from the CSO's perspective, I want to stop nagging, or I want to stop complaining, or I want to acknowledge my loved one's positive behaviors. So they would put that list together. And then there's the next two questions are a self-assessment of how important and how confident do they feel about making these changes. And they would evaluate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 to see where they lie and how important and how confident they are about this change. And then the next statement and reflection is, how important is this? What reasons? What are their reasons for making this change? And they should be able to come up with these reasons. If not, they're probably not going to be successful at making this change. So this is what they really want from this change. I want a healthy relationship with my loved one, or I would like to be that positive influence for my loved one. And then after that, they will really detail out the steps that they are going to take to make these changes. And they should be specific and detailed. For example, it should be, when I see my loved one doing something irritable, I'm going to walk away. I will allow my loved one to make their own decisions. I'm not going to tell them what to do. I will ask permission to my loved one before giving my thoughts and my opinions. So again, they detailing this out, and there's going to be many steps. I'm just giving you a few examples here, but this should be very detailed. And then they would like to identify people that can help them make this change. Change is difficult, and they need to rely on support people and who those individuals are to hopefully get them through that change process. So, things like my SMART family and friend group, or, a friend, a sister, a cousin, then they should identify so they know who to go to when they are struggling. And then the next statement is, how do they know their plan is working? And basically what it's asking is, what do they hope will happen as a result of making this change? So, for example, I'll no longer make negative comments or yell at my loved one. Or maybe I'll continue to state something positive to my loved one. Or I'm not managing my loved one's recovery choices and path. So they state those out. And then the last thing, they should always identify obstacles that could interfere with their plan. Interferences do come up, and they should anticipate those situations so they have a plan for that. So for example, if I don't continue to attend my SMART meetings, I may not work the tools. Or if I don't practice my own self-care activities, I may find that I get very frustrated easy and not respond appropriately to my loved one. Or if I don't maintain healthy boundaries, I may return to my old behaviors and the situation may get worse. So that was from the CSO's perspective. And then this next slide is really from the loved one's perspective. It's done the exact same way. But what I liked about this change plan worksheet is that last statement, or that last question, because it gets them to further reflect on what would they do if the plan isn't working. And so that gives them some thought to come up with some strategies if they see that that plan isn't working. Very effective, and this is a tool that you would like to share with individuals that are ready to make a change in their life and they want to do something different. but, and they need a guide to help them do that successfully. So I think it's also important to remind your CSOs that they shouldn't be surprised by a loved one's desire to go back to old ways of doing things from time to time. They're not in denial, they're not being stubborn, they're just simply remembering what has worked for them in the past. So learning different behaviors hardly ever happens without that occasional return back to old behaviors. And it can be frustrating for the CSO, and they can get mad and upset, but encouraging the CSOs that this is a part of the change process, should be looked at as normal. And I think that's helpful if they can anticipate that this may happen, so that they have a plan on how they will react if this does occur. It can be very helpful. So I'm going to open it up here for your thoughts. Does anyone want to share an experience they've had working with clients or family members where they were successful or they struggled in helping that person make a behavioral change? Or does anyone want to share their experiences with using the CBA tool or that change plan worksheet? Feel free to unmute your mic or use the raise hand feature, or put a comments in the chat box. Well, what I'll share, what I've experienced in facilitating meetings is when I share that CBA tool, and a lot of times CSOs have that goal that they want to stop nagging and pleading and getting emotional, things like that. But they're afraid to make that step because they think their loved one will see that lack of response as approval for their behavior. So they're afraid to make that step. But once they complete this tool and look at that, the costs and the benefits, and they realize how much energy they were spending in nagging, pleading, and complaining about the loved one, and they see the benefits of stopping that behavior, it really becomes a game changer for them. And when they after they complete that and carry out that new activity, that new behavior, and they come back to meetings and say, I wish I would have done it earlier. It was really helpful to be able to change that one behavior and see that I'm not wasting so much time on a response that I know is not effective at all in the way to handle the situation. So I see that Matt says uses the CBA tool of patience and find it to be very helpful. Thanks, Matt, for sharing that. All right, well, I'll go ahead and move on to our point 2 of the Smart Recovery 4-point system. And they have adapted this point for CSOs.
Lisa, it looks like someone's raised their hand.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Christy. Thank you, John.
Sorry. First, I wanted to thank you, Lisa. I'm just so impressed with SMART, and I'm excited about it coming to our community, because I know it's going to be so helpful. And the tools I just love. And so I wanted to ask you if, at the end of the session, if you could if you do have available a list of all the local meetings, if there are any family and friends SMART recovery meetings that's running, because I do know a lot of families that could benefit and need a support group like that. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Christy. And yeah, I agree. SMART changed my life, the learning the tools, and they think, why didn't I do that earlier? The tools are not difficult to implement, but you don't think about it when you're in the midst of a very stressful situation. But so thank you for bringing that up. And I will get a list together for next week, and I'll put that on a slide so that everybody can have that list, especially for the family and friends meetings. And, they do have smartrecovery.org, has a website, and I know I'm going to share that link sometime later, or John's going to share it sometime in this session. And there is a method to register, but the registration is simply just using, getting your email and getting your name on the registration list so that you can see all the resources as well as the meeting times. But I will share that. I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. All right, so coping with urges is the point two, the smart recovery system, and they have adapted this again for the CSOs to include boundary issues and communication problems. So urges can be compared to scratching an itch. We've all had that intense itch from bug bites, and it feels like the only relief for this discomfort is to scratch long and hard with your fingernails. And while scratching does make it feel better short term, there are long-term consequences such as permanent scarring or vulnerability to infection. So finding other ways to cope with an itch, such as using like an anti-itch cream or a oatmeal bath, doesn't really seem as satisfying as your fingernails, but it does produce those long-term benefits like a skin-free of scarring and no infection. So we can compare this itching analogy to a CSO situation where they have an urge to respond to a stressful situation with their loved one by rescuing or fixing or yelling or nagging or pleading, whatever. They do provide short-term benefits. They fix that situation, but only temporarily. But they have long-term consequences where there's no change or no motivation to change by the loved one. So, and the same goes for a loved one who is dealing with urges to use. When they give into that urge, there is a short-term benefit, but there's long-term negative consequences. And in both situations, the person learns that finding alternative coping strategies short-term is challenging. It will be, but they will find those long-term benefits. So this is a reminder to the individuals you work with to keep their eye on that long-term goal. Is it a healthy relationship with their loved one, or for a loved one, maybe it's being on a recovery path. Note to them that short-term is difficult, is challenging, but they are going to get those long-term benefits, and that is a key to change in their life. So just to review what boundaries are, remember they're guidelines or they're rules that a person has identified for themselves that offer protection over the things they value, their personal property, and their safety, their emotional safety and their physical safety. Boundaries are not about the other person or their actions or their words, things that they don't have any control over. So when addiction is an issue, boundary problems can multiply quickly. A loved one will show behaviors that are very challenging. The verbal outbursts, the lack of respect for property, ignoring calls, texts, things like that. And then the CSO responds with their own verbal insults and nagging. So as the addiction worsens and things get very much out of control, boundaries either become non-existent, or this can lead to like a wall being constructed between the CSO and the loved one, in which there's no communication happening at all. So establishing healthy boundaries is a real challenge for the CSO, but it is critical in helping that loved one to a path of recovery. So I think it's important always to review to the CSO what is a boundary and what is not. And I found in the meetings that I facilitate, this is often very confusing to CSOs. Remember, boundaries are guidelines to protect one's own safety. It's not telling that person how to live their life. Even though I may not agree with that person's choices, I can't tell them how to live. And that isn't a boundary because I don't have control over their lives. So for example, if the CSOs naturally would like to see a loved one on a path of recovery and their using is not the boundary issue. And this because the CSO can't demand that they stop, but they can say there is no drug use in my house because that does impact my safety and my well-being. So they can make those boundaries. request. Another example I found is that many CSOs allow their loved one to live with them under conditions, meaning that they have to go to this treatment, they have to see this counselor, they have to go to these meetings daily. And when the loved one doesn't follow through on one of those conditions, the CSO gets very upset and thinks a boundary's been crossed. But in reality, what the CSO was doing was trying to control the loved one's behavior and actions. And that's just something they don't have control over. So up here on the slide, I have some examples of boundaries, and I'm going to review them here. So again, the house rule of no substance use in the house is absolutely a healthy boundary because it impacts one's safety. But I can't demand that the loved one stop using or go into treatment, or go to this meeting or see this counselor. I can have a healthy boundary request of walking away when we're in a verbal argument and I'm not feeling comfortable. That's certainly healthy. But I can't tell the loved one what they can't say, or they can't argue with me because I don't have control what comes out of their mouth. I can certainly say there's no smoking in my house because it impacts me physically and I don't like it, but I can't tell them they can never smoke. I can say I'm not going to take your texts or your phone calls after 10 o'clock at night because I want to sleep without being interrupted. But if I don't ever respond to their texts or calls, that's again putting that wall up, and that is not a healthy boundary. Now, I should asterisk that last response of never responding to loved ones' texts and calls. If there is a case of intimate partner violence, that is the exception. That is a boundary that must be carried through and maintained for their own safety and their own protection. So this tool comes from Helping Families Help website. And this is not a smart tool, but I have shared this tool in my family and friends meetings, and I've received a lot of positive feedback. I think it's a great tool, especially when the CSO is having trouble figuring out what is the appropriate boundary request and defining that boundary. So it's called the Want, Willing, Won't tool. And it helps guide the CSOs to what won't they tolerate, what are they willing to tolerate in order to pursue what they want. So when the boundaries are really clear to the CSO, they're going to have an easier time setting them, maintaining them, and communicating them to the loved one. So basically, what this tool is a set of questions that the CSO reflects on. So let's use the example that the loved one often steals money or items from the CSO. So their first reflection question is, what do I want out of the situation? And they, for example, could say, I want to keep my personal items safe and secure, which is a reasonable, goal. And then they further reflect on, what am I willing to experience? I may not like it, but I'm willing to tolerate this. So the CSO really has to reflect on what are they willing to experience here. So for example, they could say, I'm willing to have my loved one upset with me when I make this boundary request. I'm willing to feel uncomfortable having this conversation with my loved one. Or I'm willing to put a lock on my bedroom door. So those are some examples, but they would list all the things that they're willing to tolerate. And then the last reflection is, what is it that I won't do, or at least I won't let happen without a response? So the some examples here is, I'm not going to stay in the conversation if I'm being disrespected. I won't stay silent if my loved one steals or destroys my property. I'm going to let them know. I won't allow my loved one to stay in my house if my personal items are being destroyed or stolen. So now the CSO has a guide to providing this boundary request, and it may be, they may feel like they're going to carry this out by putting a lock on their bedroom door, Maybe they're going to ask their loved one to leave the house when they leave the house, or maybe they're going to ask the loved one to permanently leave the house. Whatever boundary request that is, they have this guide now that will help them define this boundary and then also communicate it to the loved one. So I really think it's a very helpful tool, especially for those individuals that struggle with, how should I say this? And is this really a boundary or not? So allowing the loved one to experience natural or what we call negative consequences of their behavior can be a very effective strategy to helping maintain healthy boundaries with the loved one, and also encouraging them to change their behavior. So a lot of times that CSO feels the urge to fix or rescue their loved one when they're in a difficult situation. They provide money for them, they call in sick for them, they make excuses of why they're absent. And when the CSO carries out one of these actions, they are unintentionally reinforcing or supporting that substance use and the negative behaviors. They don't do that intentionally, naturally, but they are doing it, encouraging that. So it's only natural for them to want to help the loved one that's clearly in distress. These are individuals they love dearly, but these actions do prevent them from that person accepting responsibility for their own behavior. And the end result is going to be no motivation to change from the loved one. So what I have up here on the screen is for not lending money to pay a bill. Maybe that loved one has used money for substances, and now they need money for gas or electric bill or putting gas in their car, whatever. Not lending that money, allowing them to accept that responsibility of their choices that they made can be very effective. Letting them oversleep, not being their personal alarm clock when they've been out late partying and now they have to get up early for work. Letting them feel those consequences. Not making any excuses if their behavior becomes unruly, especially when you're at an event or a family get together, not coming to their defense and saying, well, they're just having a bad day or they've been under some stress lately. And then learning to attend events without them. That can be very effective, especially that the CSO wants to attend those events and they want to be with other people. Learning to accept that you're going to go alone. That can be very helpful so that the loved one sees that, because of their actions, they were not able to attend some event that maybe they were looking forward to. So allowing for natural or these negative consequences is very different than what you hear, that tough love or let them hit rock bottom approach. That is not recommended. SMART really strongly discourages family members from allowing that to happen, because that is really cutting off all resources, support, and contact. And you really need to be in contact with that loved one to hopefully be that influence so that they can make some positive changes. And they typically are very harsh and counterproductive. So remember, consequences should always be safe to allow. You would never allow or put a person in the position that they were forced to drive home under the influence. So the combination of those healthy boundaries that we just discussed and allowing these natural consequences and then reinforcing any positive behaviors you see from that loved one, that combination will increase the likelihood that that loved one will be motivated to change behavior. Another area that the CSO struggles with is communication and that constant urge to nag. And over time, as the addiction gets worse, both the CSO, I got a message that Zoom quit. Is that correct?
It looks like you're back. I think it was just a little hiccup.
Okay. Hopefully no more. Okay. So over time, as the addiction gets worse, both the CSO and the loved one's communication deteriorates. So you can help the CSOs that you're working with improve their communication skills by providing them a few suggestions. So the PIAS tool is very helpful in getting individuals to communicate more effectively. And PIAS is an acronym that stands for positive communication, using the I statements, the understanding statements, and sharing responsibility. So let me go over each one of these individually here. So P for positive communication, try and encourage that CSO to be positive as many times as possible. And one way they can do that is just stop making negative comments. When they see something that's irritable or the loved one's doing something that's driving them crazy, don't comment on it. Stop complaining. Because, and then also search for ways to make positive comments. And that could be very impactful in that relationship once they stop doing that. If the loved one can just do things simple as like a smile in the morning and say, good morning, that could be change the way they respond to their loved one. Or saying things like, you really mean a lot to me, or I value our relationship. Again, these approaches help that person feel appreciated, and they're also not constantly the recipient of their complaints. Using the I statements is also very effective, which means starting your sentence with I instead of you. It helps communicate the needs or feelings without blaming or criticizing. So, for example, I could say, I was upset when I came home to a messy house. That's just relaying how I felt. And that's going to be heard differently by the person if I came home and said, you are so lazy, you're such a slob, I can't believe you left the house such a mess. These words lead the person to become very defensive and wanting to fight back. So when a person starts a sentence with you, and of course they're usually pointing their finger, that other person's going to feel blamed and criticized and become very defensive, and it is never productive. You understanding, this can be carried out by listening. Listening is such an important communication skill that I don't think CSOs realize that this is a skill that they need to work on. So often they shut the loved one down and they don't really listen to what the loved one is trying to say to them. So encouraging them to ask those open-ended questions or doing that active listening skills where they reflect back on what they heard the person is saying in a non-judgmental tone is very effective, because you're trying to understand what that person is saying from their perspective. So making statements like, boy, this must have been very frustrating for you, or I understand you're not telling me everything because you often feel judged. That can be a game changer. That can really change the relationship and allow the person to reflect more. And then S stands for sharing responsibility. So finding solutions together. So it shows that both parties are interested in solving, not blaming. And it helps with the thought, I'm right, you're wrong. Now just do as I tell you. And that's not effective either. So saying statements like, would it be helpful if I did such and such, or simply, how can I help here? That can go a long way in connecting. And when connection is made and relationships are built, that can allow that loved one to be open to hearing more of what that CSO is offering to the loved one. So another communication technique, it comes from the Center for Motivation and Change, and it's one of the CRAFT strategies. They use the acronym LOVE, and some of these overlap with the PIAS communication. But again, listening, I just mentioned how important that is, especially the active listening skill or summarizing what the person's saying. O stands for offering information. So the important point here is encouraging your CSOs to not tell the loved one what to do, not giving them any options at all. You want to offer options and give them choices, and that will be much more effective. So saying things like, would it be okay if I share my thoughts with you on this topic? Or can I talk to you about some different options I learned about treatment that are available to you in this area? That will be better heard than saying, you need to go here. V for validating, just as a simple act of acknowledging another person's experience without needing to qualify it in any way. So what I hear you saying is that using drugs helps you feel less anxious when you're interacting with people. Again, very effective, and it confirms to that person that you're truly listening and hearing what they're saying. And then E, empathizing, is truly that, given that truly trying to feel where that loved one is, putting themselves in that loved one's shoes, understanding their point of view. So saying statements like, wow, that must have been very scary, or I would have been upset too if I was in that situation, can be very helpful. So honestly, I really believe when you're working with the CSOs to really help them build their communication skills, that can probably be one of the most effective strategies and tools that Smart Recovery offers to build that relationship and hopefully change that dynamics, that they would be open to making some changes. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second. And if does anyone want to share any stories about boundaries, communications that have come up with your experiences working with your CSOs or in your meetings?
I'm sorry.
No,
I
don't
hate
apologize.
to be the person to volunteer, but my family's been impacted by this so much that when I not only think about my recovery journey, but one of my siblings, just reflection on how we could have done things better. And so all while I've been training for SMART and just throughout, my life, the people that I know that is, in recovery and have been through the recovery journey. This is just SMART is just amazing, and it's effective, and it makes more sense. So I know with our family, when any of us, whether it's been with addictive behaviors, dealing with substance use, or with mental health, it was tended that you get cut off, and that's in many families, and so and that's not effective. So I just thank you again for sharing this, and for it getting out here to be able to effectively help, not only recoveries like myself, but also family members on how to help and support and be there. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Christy. I know you made the comment about when we reflect on how we respond and we know those ways were not effective. I always remind individuals that we can't change what we did in the past, but we now have a new way of responding going forward. So not to spend time with regrets, about the way we responded in the past. We've learned new ways, and that are effective and can help us move forward. So that's important too, because we can really be critical of ourselves and be our own worst critic as far as having our own shame about the way we responded. So thank you for your comments. So point 3 of the SMART recovery system is managing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we know our thoughts do create emotional feelings such as anger, resentment, and these feelings can create negative behaviors such as criticizing or finding fault with people. And that becomes a vicious cycle. So many of our behaviors are influenced by the way we're thinking about a particular event or situation. So for example, the CSO who just had an argument with their loved one, and they're thinking, boy, they're so inconsiderate. And they start to build up feelings of anger and resentment. and they start to say negative words and criticize a loved one. And that just reinforces in their mind that their loved one is inconsiderate. And that becomes that vicious cycle. But there is a way to break that cycle of thinking. And the ABC tool is very effective for breaking that cycle and in events that really upset us. So the ABC tool is an exercise from Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, REBT. It's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's very simple to use, and it works in all situations. So when someone finds themselves emotionally upset about a particular situation, have them do this little exercise. So they identify the activating event. What led to the emotional upset? So for example, the argument with the CSO and the loved one. And then have them list all their beliefs or what their brain was telling them about the situation. For example, that CSO is so controlling and will never be able to have a normal relationship, or that loved one is lazy or inconsiderate, well, they'll never get better. Listing all those unhelpful or irrational beliefs that they had about that situation and that person. What that allows them to do is get to see the consequences, where they start to reflect on what feelings are they feeling, because of this, because of this argument and because of these feelings that I have attached to this situation, I'm feeling angry, mad, sad, fearful, whatever it is. And listing all those. Well, that's great, Shirley. I know I love this tool too, and it's very simple to use and very helpful. So I think when you work this tool with individuals, it will help them see it's not really just that event, that argument that gave them such the strong feelings. It was the belief that other person was inconsiderate or trying to be controlling or wanting their way. That's what gave them the strong feelings. And we know that another person can experience that similar event and have a different reaction because they have different beliefs about that event. So let me give you an example, a very simple example here of this analogy of this ABC tool. In this scenario, I'm just going to demonstrate how 4 people can experience the exact same event but have different reactions based on their thinking. So if I'm outside walking on a beautiful day and I step in dog doo-doo and I get so angry because it's my belief that everyone should clean up after their dogs and they should be heavily fined if they don't. And I demand to know whose dog it is, and I'm going to tell that person how I feel. Now, John is out walking on a beautiful day and he too steps in dog doo-doo and he gets anxious because he's so afraid someone may have seen this happen, and he believes what a fool he is, and he fears that he's being laughed at. And he feels that, he starts to feel that he's worthless, and because he's always doing silly things like this. Now, Chris is out walking too on a beautiful day, and he too steps in the dog doo-doo, and he gets real sad and depressed right away because he immediately starts to think, what an inattentive fool I am for not watching where I'm walking. I can never do anything right. I'm always doing dumb things like this. And then lastly, Molly's out walking too on a beautiful day, and she steps in the dog doo-doo, but she just smiles and laughs because she's so grateful she's wearing shoes that day. So you have the exact same situation, but different reactions because of the different beliefs they have about that situation. So let me explain here in a more real life example is you have a loved one not responding to the calls or texts from a CSO. So that's the activating event. And the CSO starts to believe, oh, they must be using again. It's all my fault. I should have watched them more closely. And they start to develop these feelings of anxiety, despair, and fear. So, the key to changing those feelings is challenging our irrational beliefs, the B part, because that will be helpful in changing our thoughts and responses. So we know when a person's upset about an event, it's not just the event, it's the other thinking related to that. And it wasn't the loved one not responding to the texts and phone calls. It was the thought of them returning back to old behaviors or the putting blame on themselves for not watching over them better. That's what really stirred the emotional upset. And we all have these irrational beliefs and thinkings, and changing it from irrational to healthy beliefs can be done, but it takes a lot of practice. So it's important to understand that our irrational thinking stems from three basic beliefs. One, we don't want to make a mistake. We can't accept ourselves when a mistake is made. We think, oh, everyone's judging us, or I should have known better. I shouldn't have done that. What a fool I am. And we really get upset when we make a mistake. Or we put this demand on other people that they should act how we think they should act. We put these expectations, and when they don't meet our expectations, we get angry or mad. So, we have this thinking, after all I've done for them, they owe it to me, or they must seek treatment if they want a relationship with me. And then we put this demand that life should be free of hassles and discomfort. We don't want anything uncomfortable. We want life to be smooth, and we don't like that roller coaster ride. So we think, oh, life should be free of struggles, or I shouldn't feel overwhelmed, or I can't believe I have to deal with this again. So, how do we change those irrational thoughts to healthy beliefs? Again, the answer is disputing them. And that's the D part in the ABC tool. If we can ask or challenge ourselves with these questions. So, is this belief really true? Is it true that my loved one is using again just because they didn't answer my phone calls or texts? If they are gone back to using again, is it really true that it's all my fault? Where's the evidence to support this belief? Where do I have evidence that they returned back to use? Do I have evidence that this is all my fault? Where is this belief helpful? Is it really helpful to believe that my loved one must never return back to old behaviors? Can I really control my loved one's behaviors? And is this belief providing me hope? Where is it said that I should never have any struggles or discomfort or challenges? So when we can effectively dispute these beliefs and really reflect on this, this will lead us to the E, effective beliefs, which is the E in the ABC tool, and really broaden our perspective and our thinking. So instead of having that narrow thought we originally had when we did the original ABC tool, now we are thinking in a different light, and it really is effective. So we can come up with some examples like, yeah, maybe it was disappointing to see my loved one return to old ways, but I can't accept responsibility for that. We're all responsible for our own behavior. Or just because my loved one didn't respond to my text doesn't mean that they're using. I don't have proof of that. Or if this is true that my loved one is back to using, I know that I can't control someone else's behavior. And then last example, life has its challenges, and loving someone with an addiction disorder can have its moments. But there's also been successes. So again, this is some examples of how you can change your thinking from irrational to rational and healthy. So I always like this statement by Xavier Amador, and I know we're getting a little short on time, so I am going to go to point 4, and hopefully we'll have a couple minutes at the end to share any thoughts and comments here. So point 4, the last point of the SMART recovery system, is living a balanced life. So for CSOs, we know that life can become very unbalanced. Our total focus is on our loved one, leaving little room for anything else in our lives, at the expense of our own emotional well-being, our own personal values, and other aspects of our lives. So the tool we like to use here in Smart Recovery is called the Lifestyle Balance Pie. Very simple exercise to evaluate how the person is doing in meeting their own personal goals in areas that are important to them. So in this exercise, again, you have them get out a piece of paper and draw a large circle on the piece of paper, and then have that circle divided into 8 sections. And in each section, have them label that section with one of the values that is important to them. They have good health, good support system, healthy relationship with loved ones, satisfying job, finances, whatever it is that's important. And then within each of the slice or each of the section, have them draw a line from the center point on out to the edge and draw markings on that line from 0 to 10. And they would do that for each section. And now have them evaluate each of these values. How satisfied are they in their lives in meeting this particular value? Where 0 is totally unsatisfied to 10, they're totally satisfied. And they would mark it with a dot on each of that area of the ruler line, and do that for all 8 values. And once they're done, they would connect those dots like you see on the second-hand circle. And again, they get a visual view. How well are they meeting values that are important in their own lives? Are just a couple of them, low scoring, or is it mostly all of them? And this again can be an aha moment for that person filling out this, doing this exercise, realizing that they have to make changes. And a helpful tool to get them to develop these changes is that change plan worksheet. So they pick out a value, just one. Don't have them pick out and do all the values because it's too overwhelming. Work on one, get out that change plan worksheet and come up with a plan to change, help them change their life. Just a reminder, to CSOs that when they practice self-care, that's not selfish. The best way to help their loved ones is pay attention to their own needs and make sure that they're taking care of themselves. So in my meetings and the family and friends recovery meetings, I like to remind them, if they really want to see their loved one on a recovery path, it'll first require them to take care of themselves before addressing the needs of their loved one. It's the same principle as putting on your oxygen mask first when you're on a plane before helping others. And thanks, Chris, for putting that link for that lifestyle balance pie. So I'm going to share some of the resources that you could offer the CSOs that you work with. All these resources are great and very helpful. Of course, the Family and Friends Handbook is very good because it has all the SMART tools in there. And they show examples of the SMART tool, how to use them and implement them in different situations. And it's even provides space for the person to write down some of their interactions and strategies they use, what worked, what didn't work, so they can track the progress. Get Your Loved Ones Sober, it focuses on alternative strategies for the CSO. Beyond Addiction was written by the founders and the director for Center for Motivation and Change. And they just reaffirmed that kindness and positive reinforcement is really what makes someone change, not shame or guilt. And then CRAFT resources. I really like this CRAFT. These are all free. They have these 20-minute guides and I think, John, I think you put that in the chat box already, but it separates it out to a partner guide and a parent's guide, and they just offer practical ideas and exercise to help that CSO to help the loved one through that change process. They're, again, very helpful and, again, free. So I also often remind my CSOs in the meeting, they're in a position to have enormous influence over their loved one. So when they can implement some of these strategies and respond differently, they can really have a major impact on that relationship. So the Beyond Addiction workbook, this is brand new. This just came out this year, and it was published, by the Beyond Addiction authors. And again, it offers practical evidence-based skills. And then Invitation for Change, that too came out just this last year, and kind of walks people through a particular topic and exercises to help them work through and develop change of behavior. So I have all these resources. I have used them. I think they're very helpful. So I would encourage you to share them with the CSOs and the family members that you are working with in your individual work settings. So let's see. Trying to make sure I finish on time. So I will open it up for any questions or comments. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, this is Lou Nichols. Do you need a special certification to do this, or to lead one of these smart groups, or can you just have the proper training like we've received today and use some of the materials that you've given us and lead one?
It's a great question, Lou. They do have a process. So you do have to go through what's called the facilitator training, and they have one for the recovery side and one for family and friends. So it is, and I can't remember now, it is maybe 6 or 8 weeks. You start to learn the tools, you implement the tools, and you do some practices in the meetings. And I thought they were very helpful, and it gave you the confidence to facilitate a meeting. And there is a charge for those trainings, but a lot of times they do offer like scholarships so that they're free. And you can contact Smart Recovery to let them know that you're interested in facilitating. That's a great question.